Hey, Matt.
Hi, Dan.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm going to apologize to Blogging Head TV viewers. You can't see this, but I'm wearing an incredibly loud Hawaiian shirt today.
Oh, well, that's fun.
Well, it's the end of classes here, and, therefore, us professors don't need to dress up. And indeed, this is now around the time of the year where I always have to answer the question that my parents ask, which is, so you're not teaching? And I have to say, yes. And then they say, but you're doing research. But the way they say research is sort of said in quotes like it's not real work. So,
Sure.
I figure I might as well play up to the stereotype and, look
right,
like I'm on
Hawaiian
vacation.
Shirt. No, I understand. Try telling people you have a new job where you're going to be a full-time professional blogger.
That's a good point. Congratulations. I should add this, that you've made the jump to the Atlantic.
Yes, thank you.
Did you ever think, you were going to be paid full-time to do what if I had told you this, 10 years ago, this is what you were going to do for a living?
10 years ago? No.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting sign of how things change. I definitely remember, when I first started doing it, I thought of doing the blog as kind of like a loss leader for, becoming a quote-unquote
right.
real journalest, and now it's more the other way around.
Yeah. No, it still is a loss leader for me, but I agree that it's, when I started blogging, I thought I was going to do it for a year and then write this sort of obscure little pedagogical article about blogging and how it can be an adjunct to teaching, and then, people started reading it, and, well,
sure.
5 years later, here we are.
Right. Wait, okay, well, what was our first actual topic here?
What'd you say?
What was our first real topic?
I believe our first real topic, well, speaking of blogging, as a career.
Oh, was blogging, right, yes.
The fact that you are now, I think you're part of the wonkosphere. That's what John Chait labeled you as?
Yeah, well, so John Chait has this big article about the netroots, and he draws on a distinction that Henry Farrell has made, who I believe has co-authored some stuff about blogs with you.
That's correct, yes.
Right. And so, Henry draws a distinction between what he calls the netroots, which is like activist sites, and what he calls the wonkosphere, which is, also liberal sites, but written by, people who are journalists or people who are academics or people who work at think tanks.
People who are professionals who it's not their primary job to blog, I would say.
Right, but not just that, but people who are more like, who are sort of putting op-eds on the internet. Yeah. Rather than people who are using the internet as a political organizing tool.
Right, that's a safe statement, yeah.
Right. So John puts me in the wonkosphere side, and then writes about the netroots as a whole. Although it seemed to me that in the way he wrote it, he was actually being a little bit elliptical and intends for a substantial amount of his critique of netroots people actually to apply to a broader range.
So you think his criticism of the netroots actually applies to the to bloggers writ large as well?
Yeah, I think that's what he's implying. So he writes that the netroots engage in a certain amount of sort of intellectual dishonesty, putting stuff out there in bad faith, trying to act sort of like the worst of the right wing,
the Grover Norquist style of the GOP.
Right, and to form a sort of equivalent to Rush Limbaugh, that kind of thing. And then he also suggests, well, and I think there's some truth to that. I wouldn't draw any precise parallel, but I think he's obviously onto something there. But then John goes on to want to try and make the case that the reason the netroots doesn't like his employers at the New Republic is that they sort of can't handle John Chait's awesome commitment to truth telling, which seemed to me to carry with it the implication that the reason the netroots doesn't hate Paul Krugman or Matt Yglesias or Josh Marshall or Kevin Drum and so on and so forth is that even though John has avoided saying it directly, that he thinks that we have become hacks who don't have this commitment to the truth that gets him in trouble.
Right. I have a slightly different interpretation. You've made this point. Brad DeLong made this point, I think, in a post where he pointed out the fact that, netroots people like Atrios had gone after him for making, wonky points. I mean, I think the point of the Chait piece seemed to me, there were 2 points. The first was, I think he actually did welcome the netroots, because in his, mind, as, someone who clearly leans left, he's very happy that there's now a counterweight to the Grover Norquist style, attack wing of the GOP, and therefore, he wants to see more.
That's true. He's definitely glad, all things considered.
Right. I think he likes having a more level playing field. I think what bothers him is the process through which, I think what bothers him is not the outcome, but the process. His belief that the netroots, on a whole, care about winning much more than they care about, some sort of higher commitment to the truth or, what the standards are for making a political point. And I mean, you're right. I think his language was sloppy in terms of describing the relationship between the netroots and the wonkosphere. I mean, the way I would interpret that relationship is slightly different, which is the netroots care about winning uber alles, because much of the liberal wonkosphere, on the whole, is going to make points that probably support the netroots. Not all the time, but most of the time.
Right.
They're likely to lay off the netroots, or they're likely to lay off, policy wonks like DeLong, unless they actually then do these sort of, make a point that potentially undercuts them. But I think what bothers Chait is the fact that, and this gets to the larger question of what the purpose that blogs serve, because blogs have also been talked about as a substitute for traditional journalism. I think he fears these groups, understandably, because people will look at them as, even advocacy journalism, when in fact it's not even clear that's what they do. I would argue the wonkosphere is advocacy journalism. I would argue the netroots are not advocacy journalism; they're just partisans.
No, right. I agree with that, and I think that a lot of John's characterization, most of it really, of the netroots is true and does a service to people who, I think see a lot of words on web pages and can get confused. But there was this, I think, grading a presumption, a presumption that graded to a lot of us that this quality he's pointing out in the netroots is, unique to them. And for example, John works for a magazine which published the allegation that George Soros was a young cog in the Hitlerite wheel. And this accusation was completely factually baseless, malicious, and was leveled against Soros, I think pretty clearly because, there'd been talk in the air that George Soros would put money behind trying to fund counterweights to AIPAC. And generally speaking, the New Republic, not only supported the war in its war-supporting days, but, did so in an activist-y kind of manner, and I think not necessarily in a bad way. I mean, bad in the sense that they got it wrong, but that, they saw themselves as part of this sort of liberal hawk movement at an important historical moment, a crossroads for America. They had these ideas that they strongly believed in, and what they were doing during that period was campaigning for their ideas. Which I think is a fairly normal thing for a small magazine to do. Certainly the American Prospect, has its campaigns, has its issues. And, I don't think any of the magazines in that category would exist if not for that kind of thing. But that it's, odd and a little disingenuous to pretend that what journalists are doing is just speaking from a high mountain of truth, when I think there's a real continuum of motives.
I mean... No, I tend to agree. I think there's something additional, though, with TNR, and it's partly the style with which they write. And I mean, this is an approach that Michael Kinsley pioneered when he was at the New Republic, which was the idea that you can make greater way. It's part of their niche marketing, which is their niche is to say, contrary to the conventional wisdom in the particularly among Democrats, this is actually the way the world works. And so, as much as TNR would, frequently adopt positions, if you look past the Iraq War, that were generally considered mainstream Democrat or DLC Democrat, they also clearly took great, pleasure, or it was part of their skill set to go after, groups further to the left and saying, look, these guys are nuts and they're dragging us down. I mean, this gets back to this whole debate, that Mickey Kaus, among others, have talked about whether or not it's worth going after people on the left.
Right. Well, and I mean, in Kaus's case, I think you see sort of the clearest example of this, though, where, he is not... I think there's a case to be made for going after the left, maybe for going after the left more than some people do. But that's literally all Mickey does, right? Which from, at this point it's clear that that's not so much a political position that he's espousing as it is
it's a personality.
He's doing.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's what the media product is. And I mean, of course, I think that's legitimate. Anyone who's expecting, as I am, as Mickey is, somebody to pay them to produce media products needs to be doing, we're not academics. We're not college professors. We're, working in the media industry, and we're supposed to get products that people want to read. Mickey has created this persona for himself, which, I don't think it's a dishonest persona. He's saying things that he thinks, but it's not a serious, rigorous effort to achieve comprehensive political truth. He's playing the Mickey Kaus character, for Slate.
No.
And... and that's the same for columnists and stuff. Part of certain columnists' brands is that every so often they go after their own side. Part of other columnists' brands is that they're feisty partisans.
Right.
That's... I think that's just the reality of it. And that to some extent, on this internet debate, I feel like I've gotten a little penalized for being more transparent about my writing process than other people. But, no one is just doing sort of stream of consciousness narratives of what I think about the world.
Well, but this then gets to an interesting and point in which, the fact that John put you in the wonkosphere, on the one hand, I think is correct, because, you do care about, the facts and these sorts of things. And you've also been very good at sort of being upfront and saying, look, this is what these are the outcomes I want. So this is why I'm going to blog about some topics and not others. But there's also, I think, most of the wonkosphere, as John puts it, are people, how to put this, are people that if asked to, could, let's say, testify before a House or Senate committee on topic A because they've got issue expertise.
Sure.
Right. And so I think this gets to an interesting question about, is there such a thing as doing good advocacy journalism, but also having certain standards about, what you consider to be salient facts, acknowledging weaknesses in your argument? Because, this is the thing. When you develop professional expertise about an issue, there are people who, will be partisan and still be considered themselves experts. But most people who, are experts generally will also accept some set of professional norms or some set of common validity tests of, this is evidence that would disprove my argument.
Right.
The question is whether, I think, how to put this? I guess my question is, do people like you, let's say, or Kevin Drum, or others who, I don't know if I would, you're interested in wonky subjects, but you wouldn't, not to insult you, actually I think this would be a compliment, you would never be asked to testify before a House committee.
No, I agree. It's Henry's terminology.
Right.
To some extent lumping, he's lumping what, journalism blogs together with expert blogs.
Right, exactly. And so,
which I think is, I think it's sociologically correct. Mm-hmm. In terms of sort of where the ties of interconnectedness go, but it's still, reasonably different products, obviously. Brad DeLong or Dan Drezner are real experts in things. Matt Yglesias and Ezra Klein are journalists who write about things that experts talk about, but, I don't do original research.
But it also gets messy because of the way the blogosphere works, which is, in my case, for example, or Brad's case, or a lot of other expert bloggers, we don't just blog about stuff that we, do original research about. We also blog about a wider variety of categories. So it gets to be a very messy categorization, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, that's true. And also, to me, actually, one of my least favorite genres of blog posts that I see sort of comes up among people in my social sphere pretty frequently is that, two people, one a libertarian and the other, one a liberal and the other like a liberal or a libertarian, will sort of engage in this kind of Google duel. where they prove that they can both provide links to academic journal articles that ostensibly back up their position. And that's like quote-unquote wonky analysis of this, but really just proves that, there are a lot of people with expert credentials in the world, and that it would be really weird if you held a mainstream political position that you couldn't find any expert backing for.
As one of the experts that occasionally gets cited, I can't quite be as hostile to this concept as you are. And I don't know. I mean, I think that it does provide a public service in the sense of saying, look, for academics, we all footnote things. I mean, this is the blog equivalent of a footnote, and I don't have.
No, sure. I mean, I think when done right, it provides useful references for people. Like if you want to see the real arguments, blah 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 blah.
Right.
But other times, I don't know. I mean, I sort of question the value of people sort of throwing links back and forth at each other of different econometric studies, of the impact of the minimum wage. I don't really know how I or any other sort of average blog reader at home is supposed to read those papers and reach a conclusion about it.
No, I don't know. This might be the difference between my approach and your approach. I actually like those debates in large part because in some cases it points me to stuff that I haven't seen yet. And so as a result, it actually is a way of sort of parsing out what the exact issues of debate are among different economists. I mean, another example of this, this actually segues into the next topic, which is this, this debate that I accidentally triggered among economists about how you model free trade.
Right.
And, who are the winners and who are the losers, and how do you, apportion the distribution of costs and benefits. This all started with Danny Roderick, who is an economist at the Kennedy School at Harvard, starting a blog in the last month, which is great news for anyone who likes economics in the blogosphere, all 10 of us. Because Danny's both a good writer and he's got a distinct point of view, and so it's good to have him on board. And I wrote a post, responding to something that he did about the distributional effects of trade, where I suggested, a little too casually, I think, that he was overlooking one of the benefits of freer trade, which was lower prices overall. And I should have explained a little more what my assumptions were going into this.
Right.
But Danny then correctly pointed out, well, that's only a partial equilibrium. Result potentially if you take a look at the general equilibrium. There are shifts in relative prices because prices of some goods might go up in free trade because you start exporting them more. And this led to an interesting debate, I think, among Roderick, and this is where the human frailties of the blogosphere become apparent. I was out of internet touch for 72 hours, missing this entire thing because I was in Europe at the time. But this inspired a very interesting debate among Roderick, Greg Mankiw, Tyler Cowen, about exactly how do you make the pro and con arguments about trade to non-economists.
Right.
And one of the things that struck me was actually the interesting sort of contrast between that kind of debate, which is clearly wonkosphere, and I actually, I would expand Henry's term. He thinks about wonkosphere as only sort of implying liberal left people. I mean, I think one of the things I like about the sort of wonky blog is that it actually allows for discussions across... For engagement, sure. Yeah, exactly. It allows for discussions across partisan divides. And one of the interesting things I think about this exchange is that it shows to a lot of people exactly the difficulties of trying as an expert to explain things in a way that non-experts can understand while still being true to whatever professional norms you hold, close and dear.
No, I thought that was good. And, I should say, to me, one of the best things about blogs is when you see the actual experts writing.
Right. Yeah.
But, trying to work out, not even necessarily for a popular audience, but because, how many people are really going to read Danny Roderick's blog? But, try to explain to, whoever may be interested and respond to people who come up with intelligent sounding things to say. Although at the same time, I think that the trade debate perennially tends to show actually the limits of sort of the somewhat circumscribed relevance of actual policy expertise to these things. If you read things like Alan Blinder's post-op-ed...
I have a post up on that today, actually.
Where, he was raising issues that... I just think are, clearly of sort of fundamental political significance. How disruptive will this be? What can be done to cushion that, so on and so forth. But that they aren't really issues in technical economics, in a certain sense, nor does it seem like there's a tendency, I think, among economists to sort of say to people who become skeptical about new trade agreements that, well, you must be ignorant, you must not understand the economics, so on and so forth. But, as Blinder's laying it out, right, I mean, vastly expanded trade with big new markets will bring large aggregate benefits to the American economy and will throw large numbers of Americans out of work. And so, I mean, I think a lot of people will read that and will not reach a Blinder's conclusion, but will instead say, oh, we should have trade restrictions. And that wouldn't be ignorance.
No,
that would be listening to the economics.
Yeah, no, this is actually the exact concern I have about Blinder. I mean, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly what Blinder is trying to say. And this is particularly puzzling, I might add, because Alan Blinder is not naive when it comes to politics. He's held a number of political positions. He was vice chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Right.
I believe he held a post within the Clinton administration before that, in the Council of Economic Advisors. And what puzzles me, for example, I mean, the piece in the Post basically says, up to 40 million jobs are going to be offshored. Now, he doesn't say
Well, he says that 40 million people are going to find themselves in offshore competing job categories.
Right, but that's not what people are going to read. I mean, you're right.
Right.
40 million, let me put it this way. He's going to say 40 million people are going to find themselves at risk of having their jobs offshore. Now, what he doesn't say is two things. First, just because you're at risk of having your job offshore doesn't mean it's going to happen. And second, and this is even much more important, Blinder actually says in a longer paper that he's written, I think at the end of 2005, that this is going to take place over 30 years. Now, that's a...
Right.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, keep going.
Okay. This is a really important point, the fact that it's going to take place over at least, a generation and a half. Because then you start to wonder what it is exactly that the policy problem is. And I think, what he wants is a sort of expanded, government programs to cushion, and retrain workers, I think along a sort of Danish model, which is fine. Except what I don't think he realizes is that when he publishes these kinds of things, that's not what people are going to be focusing on. They're going to focus on the number of 40 million jobs at risk.
Well, I mean, this is what I think I'll say, what I think he's thinking, right?
Yeah.
Which is that Blinder, like a lot of economists in the circles of the Democratic Party, wants this kind of social democratic compromise.
Yeah.
Right, where you have an open economy and a robust welfare state so that people bounce back from economic dislocations,
right.
And also so that low skill people are fairly compensated because it's odd to make the worst off among us.
No, it's true.
Bear these sacrifices. So I mean, there's a point of justice, and Blinder's view on this, I think, is perfectly standard. I mean, it's the same as Robert Rubin's view. It's the same as Brad DeLong's view. It's something that's been out there forever.
Right.
But until recently, the predominant focus of people in that camp has been on sort of trying to quelch protectionist forces inside their own political coalition.
Yeah, I agree.
And try to say, no, look, we're going to have the trade deal, and then I'm going to work with you and build the welfare state. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people have become disillusioned with that, not with that policy vision, but with that conception of politics. And what they would like to see happen, I think, is they would like to see the business groups that benefit from trade to help them, move toward this compromise position. And that's meant, in Blinder's case, right, a change in emphasis of what it is he's going to talk about. And instead, he's, I think, yes, trying to alarm people about the scale of the changes implied in the current policy environment, to, as I think he laid this out in the Post op-ed, to try to frighten people into thinking that unless we implement a much more robust welfare state, there's going to be an incredible backlash against the open economy.
I think that's what he's trying to... I agree with you. I do get at that, I think, in the post that I wrote about this. My concern on this is twofold. The first is Blinder is playing with fire here. And this is from the sort of traditional libertarian position, which is the moment you demagogue trade, the response there are usually two groups that are going to respond to concerns about trade. The first group, which is the group that Blinder cares about, and I think it's a group you should care about, are generally going to be the sort of broad number of losers from trade. That is, unskilled workers, or in Blinder's case, I mean, his concern is workers in skill groups that can genuinely be outsourced.
Right,
Fine,
certainly.
it would be nice to address that. The problem is the second group. And I think the second group is a little more powerful both within the Democratic Party and within Washington more generally, which is generally, protected interests that are better, served by raising protectionist barriers of one kind or another, either, sort of out-and-out tariffs or the sort of labor and environmental standards that, people like Danny Roderick want. And my concern is that the second, I know enough about the politics of trade policy to think that the second group is going to hijack the interests of the first group. And so therefore, I think you're going to have the worst of both worlds potentially. This is my fear, which is you will have demands for, protection, demands to do something about.
Sure, you'll have a closed economy and no welfare state.
Not so much. Not so much a closed.
I mean, not.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry. You're right. A closed economy, or an economy that closes off but doesn't provide the broad-based welfare expenditures, but instead provides relief to targeted special interest groups that are more politically powerful.
Piecemeal stability to people who are have enough political clout.
Right. And there's a front page story, I don't know if you saw it today in the New York Times, that Robin Toner did, about this very battle within the House Ways and Means Committee on this very issue. And so I think this is my concern. I understand why Blinder is doing what he's doing. I just don't know if he's playing with political fire, and I have very little confidence that the outcome that he wants is actually going to be the policy outcome.
Right, but you see, I mean, I guess I want the same outcome as Blinder wants, and I have very little confidence it's going to be the outcome either way. But, it's hard to say. I mean, I think what Blinder's doing mostly, and I completely sympathize with this, is expressing frustration at the way there are powerful interests that benefit from the multilateral trade process.
Yes, that's absolutely true.
I mean, there are in particular, intellectual property owners. Yeah. Even more so than sort of would-be importers of things. But there are others. I mean, there are a lot, right? And, the multilateral trade, they lean on the U.S. Trade Representative, so on and so forth. And, I think what Alan Blinder and I would like to see is we would like to see those kind of groups show some interest in addressing, I think the conscientious concerns that left of center people have about the impact of trade. That there's this very, that it's gotten to be too burdensome to ask sort of center-left economic wonks to be kind of perpetually stabbing important elements of their political coalition in the back on pursuit of free trade agenda that primarily benefits. I mean, it has a general benefit to the United States, which is why people are for it. But its most concentrated beneficiaries then don't lift a finger to, make these arrangements not just theoretically beneficial to everyone, but actually beneficial to everyone. And and so you're seeing a change in tactics because what was pursued sort of historically from NAFTA through to the Doha round has not really inspired the pro-trade constituency to push for any of these things. That then, if you say we should have trade restrictions, they'll turn around and say, well, no, it makes the pie larger, it can be win-win, and it can be, but it's only win-win if it actually is.
No, and part of this is there's two things going on, or three things going on, I think. The first is, you can't underestimate the sort of tyranny of the status quo when it comes to policy. And the fact is the status quo does benefit the very business interest that you're talking about, which is the U.S. is essentially a liberal, a pretty open economy. I mean, we're in many ways the most open economy in history. So, protecting the status quo is much easier than trying to change it. And therefore, I think from these business groups, they don't see why they should buy into it. I think the second thing that's going on is that I agree with you that I think that what I'll label broadly social democrats, the social democratic approach to trade, what they want to see is some sort of large shift in political pressure and public opinion such that these businesses, recognizing that the tide has turned, will sort of recognize they need to protect the feedlot and then support policies like, let's say, Lori Klutzer's wage insurance schemes or things like that.
Right.
That what they want. And then the third thing that's going on, and this is significant, is that there is a shift in public opinion, and I think that there is a rise in economic populism, but I don't think that rise in economic populism is quite as controllable as social democrats think it is, because it can lead. What you can wind up having is that populists on the left can link up very easily instead of social democrats. They can link up with populists on the right, sort of Lou Dobbs / Pat Buchanan, and produce policies that are genuinely perverse.
Right. No, I don't necessarily. I mean, yes, that certainly can happen. Although I think, interestingly, to tie back to our first conversation, right? That with the kind of scenario you were outlining, I mean, I think there's long been a sort of, not a deliberate conspiracy, but a sort of tacit right-left elite consensus that, just as you're saying, that you don't play with this kind of fire.
Yeah, I agree.
That Alan Blinder's playing with, even if the things Alan Blinder is saying are not all that controversial
right.
as economic claims. It's controversial to be saying them, and to be saying them in the way that he's saying them.
I think it's the way, because Kevin Drum got at this point in a post he had, which is what Blinder is saying in terms of the economics of it, I think is pretty much, I think he is exaggerating the magnitude of the effect, but I mean the direction I'm not going to dispute. He's right. He's fundamentally right about the economics of that. The problem is the language of the rhetoric. And what it invites. And I think you're right that there has been this sort of tacit, almost a vital center, sort of tacit agreement among pro-trade Democrats and pro-trade Republicans, or pro-internationals would be a better way of putting it, which is the Democrats have, in particular, their critics on trade. I think the Republicans have a similar problem on immigration, I would add.
Right. No, exactly.
And a lot of mainstream Republicans have taken a fair amount of hits for trying to adopt a reform, not ending of immigration. And so you're right. I think the interesting question is going to be whether or not that sort of agreement holds, or whether by people like Blinder coming forward like this, it leads to a crack in this sort of debate, in this sort of arrangement.
Right. No, I think that's right. Maybe we should move on to
I think we should.
More
lighthearted
topics. Right. While there are obviously a lot of taboos around discussing trade in America, race is just a fun subject. And this study came out recently indicating that NBA referees sort of call fouls more on opposite race players.
Right.
Which obviously the league strenuously denied, but their evidence for that seemed a little thin.
I haven't even seen the NBA counter. I did read the original, the paper, the sort of working paper. But I mean, what is the NBA? Did the NBA authorize an actual statistical analysis to try to rebut it, or was it just we know this isn't true?
Well, no. So what happened? This was actually an interesting journalistic model that one sort of wishes more people would approach. But that when this initial study came out. It was done by some academics.
Right.
I guess they gave it to a New York Times reporter. And then what the reporter did was told the NBA that she was going to do a story on this, asked them to come up with, whatever, not just a quote, but, if they had data they wanted to release. And then she took the original paper and the NBA stuff and took it to a few... I guess economists or statisticians, people who know this kind of math, but aren't necessarily, and had them read it, and all three of them told the Times that the NBA's rebuttal was unconvincing and didn't speak to the point at hand, which seemed like a good way to write this story.
Yeah.
Not one that you see all that often in journalism.
Yeah.
John Hollinger, who's a writer for ESPN and who does sort of statistical analysis, he pointed out that what's sort of missing in this initial paper is that the magnitude of the effect is actually quite small.
Well, I would say that was my response. I mean, I'm glad to hear that, because this was my reaction when I actually read the paper as opposed to the New York Times story. And I got to give the Times credit. I mean, one of the things they've done well, particularly on their website, is that they actually have the Times links to the full
stuff,
working paper, which is great for people like us who want to read it. The thing that struck me reading the analysis is two things. First, the R-squared value for these regressions that they're running is unbelievably low. They're accounting for, under 20%, I think, of the variation. This is all of the sort of, this is when they throw the kitchen sink variables in. And that's a warning sign for me, because it indicates that even if the variables show statistical significance, as you point out, it's a question of the magnitude. And furthermore, the magnitude of the magnitude, it seems questionable, because basically, as I understood it, the argument they were making is that since the majority of referee crews are white and the overwhelming majority of NBA players are black, this effect comes up primarily in the idea that white NBA refs do not call as many fouls on white NBA players.
Right.
Right. Which is such a rare occasion anyway that, even if you accept the argument, I'm not sure how dramatic an effect it has. And this is where they take
Right. Well, it's not that rare. I mean, because even though a clear majority of the players are black, right? I mean, there's 10 players on the court at any given time.
Right.
So, there are almost constantly, white people out there playing. But, at any rate, I mean, the scale was small, but the R-squared was small. The just total amount of fouls in question here tends to be pretty small. Now, it's interesting if it would make a difference. It's something like right now, the Utah Jazz are playing against the Golden State Warriors in the playoffs. And the Jazz are much, much whiter than a typical NBA team, and will frequently have 2 or 3 white players on the court, and sometimes as many as 4. I've seen them run as a lineup. And, it would be interesting to know if it makes a big impact on something like that, where, because ordinarily there's a lot of variation in the refereeing. There's not very many white players. All the teams have about, teams will have 1 or 2. And there's really, I think this is the only example of sort of an outlier white team. And there's been some evidence that that's beneficial in marketing terms, in terms of getting fans for teams that are in extremely white areas of the country, like Utah.
Yeah,
it's just at the same time the Jazz are winning.
There used to be allegations about this with the Boston Celtics in particular.
Right, yeah, from back in the day.
Right.
Although, I raised this at one point, and a bajillion Celtics fans jumped on my back and wanted to point out that those Celtics teams had a black coach back when that was extremely rare.
Well,
so Bostonians are defensive.
Yes, well, that's a real shock.
Sure.
I mean, the other thing that let me put it this way: I actually think it's an interesting paper. I think it actually calls for further research. For example, I mean, if you think about it, one of the ironies about this is that what you've got is the claim is that white NBA refs are more likely to call fouls on black players. But I could spin this another way, which is, who are the black NBA players fouling? They're probably fouling other black, it would be fascinating. Right. I think the really interesting study that someone's got to do from here on in is to actually watch the games and determine who are these players fouling. For example, if it turns out that white NBA refs call a significantly higher number of fouls on black NBA players who then foul white NBA players, that would be really powerful evidence, I think.
Yes. Also, of course, the difficulty here is that, you can't, at least I can't think of an obvious way to do sort of statistical controls for the fact that there are different kinds of players, different roles people.
Yeah, exactly.
People sort of play on the floor, and the stereotype, which seems to have, I think, some real grounding in reality, is that black players are generally quicker than the white ones.
Right.
And so you almost never see a white perimeter player, a guard or a small forward, be asked to defend like the other team's top guy.
Uh-huh.
I mean, they're usually, which, I don't know, whether that's true, whether it's a stereotype, whether it's a coincidence, but I mean, it's definitely the case that there are very few white players other than Andrei Kirilenko who are used as sort of defensive stoppers in the kind of positions where you're most likely to actually pick up fouls. Mm-hmm. So, game strategy and so forth has something to do with this. And there's, I mean, much like in football, there's this sort of not discussed, racial subtext to kind of roles and assignments that players tend to get.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, for example, often white players are. I mean, and this works in reverse. That white players are stereotyped, as you said. They're not thought of as particularly fast in the NBA. And again, this might have a grain of truth, but there are obviously individual exceptions to that. Or similarly, that white players, in the NFL aren't thought to be. They can't be wide receivers. They're not fast enough.
Right. Yeah. Right. No. And this weird. This word athleticism gets tossed around in like sports commentary circles, and it often seems to be a way of saying that someone is too white to be a receiver or a running back.
Right, and it's also problematic because often. I think in sports, calling someone calling particularly an African American athlete a gifted athlete is like the sports equivalent of calling a black politician articulate. Which is that it's the perception of they're successful because they are so gifted, as an athlete. They don't apply their brains or anything. It's just their
right. Whereas a white player has hustle and works hard and has leadership or whatever.
Right.
But no, I mean, there's certainly this sort of implication that somehow that the white players have like practiced and trained a lot.
They're gym rats, exactly.
Sort of showed up, juiced and. Ready to go. Which I guess brings us to Barry Bonds.
Yes, which, speaking of, racial perceptions about sports, ESPN released a poll earlier, I think on Sunday, that was not an online poll, but an actual scientific one, that showed dramatically different perceptions among blacks and whites about Barry Bonds approaching the all-time home run record. Namely that, blacks feel he's been treated fairly, he's been treated unfairly, and they also feel that he's been treated unfairly not because of his alleged use of steroids, but rather because of his race. Whereas I think this was 1% of white Americans thought that Bonds was being, treated badly because of his race. That was disturbing stat 1. But disturbing stat 2, this is the one that really floored me, was there was a large percentage of African Americans who refused to believe that Bonds took steroids.
Right. Wow.
Those are two gaps that you just,
I mean, on the first question, I think I'm going to have to side with African America. That the notable thing to me, not being a big baseball fan, was how noteworthy Babe Ruth's second place all-time home run record seems to be. It's the only record in sports that I can think of where the second place mark is treated with that kind of reverence and significance. And it seems clearly to me to have something to do with the fact that Babe Ruth is white and Hank Aaron isn't, and that somehow, therefore, Ruth's record has some kind of, emotional significance in virtue of it being like, I don't know, the white home run record or something.
Well, I don't know. Look, to defend the white race here,
sure.
There's another reason. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is, if you look in terms of the role that sports figures have actually played in larger American history, forgetting sports, thinking about it, how they affected the American landscape writ large. I think there are two baseball players you would pick, to date that really would fall into that category of actually change the way Americans, think, live, work, what have you. And it's Jackie Robinson and it's Babe Ruth. Because Babe Ruth popularized the game in a way that no one else did before him. So I agree with you that part of it, I think it would be foolhardy to deny that race plays a role. But there is a genuine reason that there's an affection for Babe Ruth among baseball fans, which is Babe Ruth made baseball America's pastime. He made it an exciting game to watch. He was the first sort of big celebrity. And the contrast here also is, again, and maybe you can argue this is a racial thing, but and I had a former colleague, Melissa Harris-Lacewell, who's argued this. But there's another argument as well, which is Babe Ruth was generally perceived of as a fun-loving guy who was very, media-friendly. Admittedly lived in a different time when the media wasn't going to report on some of Ruth's peccadillos. Whereas, let's face it, Barry Bonds is perceived as a complete schmuck. He's perceived as arrogant, as unfriendly to the media, as, a giant ego, and as someone who cheated. As someone who, took performance-enhancing drugs as a way to juice his record. So there are genuine reasons, potentially, to not like Barry Bonds, not just in contrast to Babe Ruth, I would add, but also in contrast to Henry Aaron.
No, sure. No, but I mean, I bring up Ruth and Aaron just because I think there are legitimate reasons. I think that people don't want Barry Bonds to sort of be their hero, but at the same time, that there are very legitimate reasons that a lot of people see this as racially linked. I mean, it's obviously it's a part of American history that if you have a black man making historically significant achievements in a field where there's this sort of pre-existing sort of racial dynamic because of Ruth and Aaron, and then you have lots of, white people, sports writers, baseball fans all over sort of stroking their chins instead of celebrating Bonds as like the greatest hitter in baseball history. I think it's totally understandable why people see it as in part racial, particularly because, what I didn't totally realize as a not extremely close baseball fan is that, the allegation isn't like that Barry Bonds had this single-handed devious plot to take steroids and cheat. That this was widespread, is my impression, in the league at the time. Bonds is accused of doing it, and you don't seem to see this level of detestation directed at other people.
Well, I would dispute that. I think you've got a grain of truth, but there's another way to dispute it. The grain of truth is you're right. I mean, my understanding is from the book Game of Shadows is that when Bonds decided to start using, in response to back in 1998 when Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa had this, home run race to see if they could beat Roger Maris's record, and they were drawing attention away from Bonds, who, even without, if he had not taken any drugs whatsoever, is a certified Hall of Famer. I mean, he's a great athlete and a gifted athlete. No, he's a great baseball player. So
he hit well and stole a lot of bases.
Yeah, exactly. No, he was a unique baseball player in a lot of ways. So on the one hand, you're right, and let's face it, Bud Selig and a lot of baseball and a lot of journalists tolerated and sort of looked the other way when that home run race was going on, even though there were a lot of allegations about steroid use and other, performance-enhancing drugs, because the home run race was good for baseball. Now, that said, it's not entirely true that Bonds is solely the focus of this ire. Mark McGwire has been pretty much shunned by almost all of baseball, since he had this disastrous performance in front of a House committee investigating steroid use in sports, and he was denied, entry into the Hall of Fame this past year, and that was entirely due to his drug use, and McGuire's right. So I'm not sure that the reason Bonds is the focus is because Bonds is about to break the all-time record. There have been other athletes, baseball players, Mark McGwire, Rafael Palmeiro last year as well, who have also, suffered, and Jason Giambi before him also, who have suffered significant amounts of, abuse because of this issue. The difference is none of them is as of yet approaching the, Henry Aaron's record, whereas Bonds is.
Historical records, right.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I saw a paper. I'll try and find it to put the link up. I saw a paper which was making the argument that.
You thought who was? I'm sorry.
I can't remember who the author of this study was.
Yeah.
But the argument of the study was that during the sort of steroid era, when some of these hitting achievements were reached, that there wasn't actually a net increase in the number of home runs per at bat.
Right.
That what happened instead was that because of the expansion of the league, there were radically more games being played.
Well,
had been in previous years, and so the probability of sort of outlier phenomena went way up.
I think there's a couple things going on. That's the first one. There were more. You're right. There were more games being played. Also, the expansion of the league meant that there were weaker pitchers.
Right.
Going on. That was another effect. There's a third effect, though, which no one really talks about, which is it's not just the hitters that were using performance-enhancing drugs.
Right. The pitchers.
The pitchers were using it too, and Roger Clemens coming back to the Yankees. Now it was interesting. Selena Roberts had a piece in the Times bringing up the fact that. Why isn't anyone talking about Clemens and performance-enhancing drugs? Because there have been some allegations made, and to be fair, there's no, concrete evidence about this whatsoever, except that Clemens, like Bonds, has had a post-35 years of age resurgence that, potentially...
Right. And the trajectory of his bulkiness is...
Say it again?
The sort of trajectory of his physical bulkiness.
Exactly.
Over those years.
It's raised some questions. And I'm uncomfortable, saying, therefore, ipso facto, Clemens is using, but it points out that, because I think it's the way baseball works. Home runs capture attention, whereas even dominating pitchers aren't quite as eye-catching. So pitchers have gotten off, I think, a little bit easier. Even though, ironically, I think since they started steroid testing, I think far more pitchers have been caught using than hitters.
Right. Which is, in some ways, makes sense, right? Because, pitchers are much more injury-prone than hitters, right? It's a bigger...
Yeah, in the sense it's recuperative. I think the other thing that the fact that people should realize is that the people who usually get caught using drugs are not the ones who are the star athletes. The Rafael Palmeiro last year, for example, was an exception. It's largely the marginal players who feel that this is the only way they can stay in the major leagues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure. Right.
All right, I think we've talked this issue to death.
Okay, fair enough. Wrap it up. And
well, did you want to talk about the French elections at all, or?
Oh, the French elections. Yeah, briefly.
Which I think that we're going to disappoint blogging heads people because I think we agree on this, which is Sarkozy won. He's promised lots of radical reform, but the nature of the French system is such that there's not going to be any radical reform.
Right. Like in any country, right? Things are the way they are in large part for, structural reasons. And nothing that happened here suggested that they would change. Sarkozy was finance minister not that long ago and tried to do some of these reforms and backed down.
Well, I think there's two things going. There were two things. The first is the French system in particular is uniquely set up so that it resists change. Not the actual this is where informal institutions matter as much as formal ones. The informal ones in France is that if you implement change without broad-based consensus, it is very easy for unions to basically bring Paris to a screeching halt.
Right.
And this is one of the jokes about how architecture actually matters in politics. The streets are so narrow in Paris that it's very easy to literally block traffic. And this has happened. I think this has happened at least twice in the last 10 years where a president or a prime minister has tried to implement dramatic reforms, run into a roadblock, and then as a result, had to retreat into foreign policy as a way of sort of making their name known.
Right.
And I don't see any necessarily reason that it's going to change this time around. And this is related to a second point, which is I think there actually is a broad consensus in France that the current system needs reform. The problem is, and it works the same way in the United States, it's very easy to have consensus that the status quo is not working. You can't get you can't get consensus on the status quo is not working, therefore we should change to policy X.
Right. Well, everyone thinks someone else's ox should be gored. I think.
Exactly. So it'll be interesting to see, for example, what comes up in France, whether it's going to be. Sarkozy has talked about implementing policies that might, on the one hand, liberalize the economy a little bit, but during the campaign, he also railed against cross-border mergers and acquisitions, and he railed against immigration, which would be policies that, let's say, libertarian types would be friendly with. So, we'll see what mixture he winds up coming up with now.
Right. Well, and also, he doesn't. There has to be a legislative election, right?
Yeah, there's a National Assembly election in June, and that's going to be crucial because...
right, and so, it'll be interesting to see, right? I mean, the electorate might feel... Ségolène Royal, I think, after initially seeming to a lot of people like a very impressive figure, eventually came across as the reverse.
Yeah.
And then a lot of French people
you're in deep trouble, by the way, when Maureen Dowd thinks you're a lightweight.
Right, no, exactly, right. And then, I think a lot of French voters seem attracted to the sort of, Rudy Giuliani-esque qualities of Sarkozy, the idea that he'll get tough on crime, law and order, that kind of thing. So one could imagine the legislative elections working as voters try to put a brake on some of his other legislative ambitions, or else it might return, a clearer sort of mandate for change, at which point, he does seem... Sarkozy seems more characterologically suited than most politicians to trying to face down street protests.
No, I agree. I agree. That's absolutely correct. And that's to defend. A lot of people have at least the commenters on my blog are ticked off because I said nothing's going to change. And they're like, "Oh, that's just the conventional wisdom. How dare you?" You can argue Sarkozy actually does seem willing potentially to stare down protesters. Although what's interesting is the timing of this, which is when is he going to start implementing these policies? Because presumably it's not in his interest to do so now, precisely because it could provoke a backlash that actually leads to a cohabitation government, which would be a nightmare for Sarkozy.
Right.
But even I'm not sure it's going to turn out terribly well.
Right. Anyone who's ever... I was in Paris during some minor wave of crippling strikes.
Okay.
And it's not that pleasant.
Exactly.
There's a reason why people back down in the face of country crippling strikes.
I will say this. Sarkozy, the one thing I've seen, which I find intriguing, and this might actually indicate that maybe he'll succeed in ways that I anticipated. I think Sarkozy is planning a special session of the National Assembly in August. And the reason this matters is that if he actually holds it in August, he and the National Assembly will be the only people living in Paris at that time.
Sure.
Because almost the rest of the entire country goes on vacation. And so it'll be interesting to see if he tries to implement change during a period where presumably the sort of people who would go to the barricades are instead in the country and will be disaffected enough so that he can actually ram changes through.
Take them by surprise.
Right. Although my suspicion is that even if he actually implements the change, it doesn't matter. Even if he gets the law changed, it doesn't matter because they'll just come back in September and wreak havoc anyway.
Right.
So,
demand that it be unimplemented or something.
Right. Exactly. So I'm not. It's an interesting innovation, but I'm not sure it's really going to. I'm not sure it's going to lead to any substantive change.
Yeah, but I always think that reporting the dramatic change is about to occur is, I think, always a sort of a good call for a news journalist. And then, predicting that, on the contrary, things will probably stay the same is a good pundit bet.
It is worth noting, though, I will say this, which is it is interesting to observe that, despite the sort of, growth of anti-Americanism in Europe, the leaders of now both France and Germany are much more significantly more pro-American than their predecessors in 2003.
Yeah, although I would say that this is because there isn't really... this is maybe too long, but I think it calls into question whether this alleged phenomenon of anti-Americanism was ever really happening. That what you had in Germany and now in France is leaders of the right who express great affection for America, have some transatlantic ties, but who promised very, very, very clearly not to have anything whatsoever to do with the tar baby of Iraq winning elections. So, was there anti-Americanism, or was there just opposition to the Iraq War?
I would not underestimate the depths of anti-Americanism in Europe right now. I say this having just been in this conference called the Brussels Forum last week. I would actually say two things. Among the elites, it's declined dramatically. Relations actually now are pretty good as things go. In small part because of the changes in administration in France and Germany, but also in no small part because the Bush administration is much less stridently anti-European than it was in 2003.
Right, Rice has put much more emphasis on this.
Yeah, beginning in 2005, the administration has actually, been reaching out to the Europeans in a way that they hadn't before, and that, to their credit, and that's yielded results. That's at the elite level, though. I think the difference is that at the mass level, there is still And maybe this is Iraq crowding out everything. But there is, you take a look at the opinion polling, there's still significant opposition to the United States in Europe, to the point where Europe sees China as in more positive terms than the United States, which is, quite a damning statement. Now, I think the interesting question is going to be whether this is an artifact of the Bush presidency or whether this will persist past 2009.
Right.
And I don't doubt that a lot of it's going to go away once Bush leaves the stage. It'll be interesting to see, though, going forward, whether it really does, revert back to prior, to pre-2001 sentiments.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's like a fun empirical test of different schools of international relations thought. Right.
It's an empirical test?
I mean,
because
if the realists are right, the Europeans should keep hating the United States and loving China as a counterweight, no matter how much we're a friendly liberal democracy and China's.
Yeah,
I guess that's not really what they're saying.
it's not quite that simple because realists don't care about public opinion. Is the problem?
Right. You see, this is exactly the sort of distortion that a semi-informed political pundit like myself might make.
Well, you see, this is why we have these blogging heads exchanges. It shows once again the wonkosphere can come together and hopefully generate useful knowledge.
And
on that positive note, I think we should probably
let's cut it off.
Yeah, let's cut it off. All right.
Okay. Cool. Good to talk to you.
Yep.